Angus, we have got you here today to discuss the news surrounding Donald Trump, tariffs. He's threatened tariffs, of course, and pretty massive ones at that, against Canada, Mexico, China and the EU, which raises the question, will the UK be next? But before we get into that, I wonder if you can lift the curtain a bit and tell us briefly about how much of Britain is owned and run by America already.
We really are very much working for America. I mean, 2 million of us work for American corporations, and the general popular figure is 1 million. And it's not just about how much we work for the Americans, it's about how much we spend with American companies. Obviously, we know about Disney and Coke and Exxon or Esso, but there are lots of, and also, of course, YouTube and Google and Apple. But there are lots of brands that we buy that people don't realise they're spending with Americans. So when we spend anything on Cadbury's or Weetabix, or we pay for a ticket for Manchester United or Chelsea or Arsenal, in all those cases, the money is going to American corporations, so much so that the average British family is sending £2,000 a year to American corporations.
Wow, that's astonishing.
One of the things that Trump is very keen to do is to make sure that American corporations pay very little UK tax on that. So he said that he'll abandon the global tax deal. But even that was very much to the Americans' advantage. It was only the US corporations paying 15% tax.
I'm going to cause a sharp intake of breath from middle-class listeners that Gale's Bakery is also...
That's US private equity owned, and US. There are these three great prongs of US ownership. There's the traditional one we've always known about, the big US corporations, but there are these two new ones that have reached deep into British business. One is big tech, which isn't just about the things you see, but behind the scenes they're supplying people. They're doing, for example, all the data for the NHS. But the other great prong is the private equity, where lots of UK companies, Waterstones, for example, is owned by US private equity.
But you write in the book, Angus, you say, when we say private equity, we mean US private equity. And when we say multinational private equty, we mean US multinational private
Indeed.
equity.
And big tech's another example. We say big tech. We should really be saying US big tech, because apart from Spotify, almost every tech company we refer to is a US company, and the profits are going one way.
So how has that been allowed to happen?
It's a combination of things. I think it's ignorance on the part of politicians. I think it's sort of civility that and sort of being in thrall to the Americans. We kind of look up to their standards. But it's also a general policy of openness, which is very misguided, it seems to me, and not the way that Americans or Europeans run their economies. So we allow the Americans to take over any companies. We also don't have a Buy British policy. The Americans have a very clear Buy America policy, and it's in American law. The Europeans do the same. But we've just become sort of ideologically so open that we've allowed ourselves to be overrun.
I mean, Rachel, you said on the podcast just a couple of weeks ago that the UK's low level of exports to the US compared to how much we import might protect us from tariffs. Certainly the government are hoping that, aren't they?
Yeah, it's really weird that the UK government are hoping that because we are bad at exporting to the US, maybe Trump will be kinder to us. And actually, like he suggested in that weird press conference earlier this week that, he might be, he seemed to get a bit muddled on the UK and Europe, but there was sort of implication that, Britain is not as bad as the rest of Europe. And by bad, he means doesn't try and, it isn't exporting too much stuff to the US or the balance is more even. It depends on how you measure it, obviously, because there's goods and services, and we do export a lot of services to the US, particularly financial services in the city and legal services and all of that. But there's a bit of sort of confusion on how the ONS measures it. There's a suggestion that maybe Trump is looking at one set of figures and the UK government is sort of saying, yeah, go on, look at those sets of figures that show that, we've got a trade deficit with you, so we shouldn't be first in line for tariffs. But it's not it doesn't say anything great about our economy that our bargaining chip is you don't have to do this to us because you're already winning this at such a colossal level that we're not even in the competition.
Absolutely. I think that's right, that we're not a threat in the way that the EU or China or Canada is in terms of exporting a lot to the US. But I think it's also that because there are so many US companies in the UK, that tariffs would actually harm US companies. So that may protect us as well.
I mean, is it that we're bad at exporting, or is it just that we don't have that many products that are solely British that haven't been already gobbled up by the US?
Yes, I think it's both. I think a lot of our companies, particularly, for example, in defence or military manufacturers, I think they've been bought by US companies. But also where we have still got UK companies, they are just not very good at exporting, I'm afraid.
What we've just been talking about between the US and UK has not obviously taken place under the Trump presidency. So let's turn to what's happening this week. And these long threatened tariffs that he threatened would drastically increase were he to come to power have sort of come to pass. It almost happened for Canada and Mexico, put on hold, a bit of brinkmanship there perhaps. How serious are these tariffs?
I have said before, I am refusing to be the Trump whisperer and trying to predict what he's serious about and what he isn't serious about. What do we know? We know that he mentioned tariffs a lot in his first presidency, and then it didn't really go anywhere. He mentioned tariffs a lot in the campaign for this presidency, and people said, yeah, he's not going to do it. And then it's one of the first things that he did, and he announced them with no warning whatsoever. But then, the Mexico and Canada ones are on pause. So it's really unclear if this was kind of like an attention-grabbing bargaining technique. Obviously, the more you threaten to do something and then don't push through with it, the less potent that kind of tactic is in the future. So I think probably we don't know. What we do know is that Trump sees trade, like the world, as a zero-sum game. So if America is importing more, that means to him that America is losing, even if American consumers are benefiting. And we also know that there is a huge amount of misunderstanding, not just in America, I think into the world in general, but about who pays for tariffs. Trump has basically said, if I impose these tariffs, it will be foreign governments, foreign companies that are paying it. Whereas actually what happens is the companies that are importing them, the US companies, have to pay them, and then they pass the money on to the consumers. And I think you are immediately going to see price rises, and also American businesses that use parts from other countries, they're going to have to put their prices up or they're going to go under as well. So it's going to be pretty much instantaneous, I think, that the consequences of this policy reveal themselves. Obviously, Trump's pretty good at going, it's not my fault. Look over there. Gaza Riviera.
It seems to me we've got two different crises going on. One is the domestic crisis that the Americans have about almost a constitutional problem about the way Trump is behaving. But for the rest of us, the rest of the world, we've got a crisis in the way he treats the international world order. And he's acting as a bully domestically and abroad. And it's the abroad that matters to us. It's that he's throwing his weight around. And he's also doing it in such a way that it's a sort of one-off trick. Other people from now on, other countries aren't going to trust him in the way that they trusted the States before.
We've said, so these threatened 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico haven't come to pass yet. They've been given this sort of short reprieve because they agreed to strengthen the border. And like you just said, Angus, he's talking about, well, you can avoid this, Canada, if you become the 51st state. How much of it is about humiliation as opposed to kind of economics?
Yes, he's a bully, isn't he? And he's using bullying tactics, which is a complete change in the world order. We're switching from a situation of the US being a senior partner in a partnership from it being a bully, and that sort of changes everything, really.
With Canada as well, though, we've got I think the tariffs proposed for Canadian energy are lower
because the US needs Canadian energy.
What's the connection here between the US business interests and the tariffs it's threatening or has already applied? These 10% tariffs on China have come in on Monday.
Well, I think they contradict each other. Obviously, for some US companies, higher prices on imports mean that they can undercut them and sell more things. But because economies are complex and, most companies are not making something from scratch, in that country itself, you need parts, you need energy, you need materials possibly from abroad. It's going to sort of immediately throw a spanner into the works of their production lines as well. And the business community has kind of very much been on the side of Trump throughout all of this, possibly because of the tax cuts that we saw in the last presidency. They kind of thought, it's worth it. maybe if he actually goes ahead with some of these, they'll start to think, oh, hang on, maybe it's not worth it after all. Or maybe he won't go ahead with them and it will all just be empty threats and that bullying behaviour that Angus was talking about.
Where are you there on that?
Hugely disruptive, isn't it? Disruptive to supply chains, disruptive to companies, disruptive to the way that the world works. And here's an irony that traditionally we've seen the right as being wanting to keep the status quo and the Conservatives as wanting to protect things as they are. But here we've got a radical right that wants to basically cause trouble. And I think Trump personally relishes the idea that he's the one causing disruption. And if it doesn't affect him personally, which it doesn't, he just loves it. He's
also indirectly helping the Canadian Liberals. I mean,
Yes.
Justin Trudeau, who did his big resignation speech a couple of weeks ago, then did a sort of very robust speech, standing up for Canada, a kind of, for those people who have seen Love Actually, the sort of Hugh Grant standing up for Britain kind of speech.
Absolutely.
And the Canadian Liberals have shut up in the polls, and the Canadian Conservative candidate, so the more Trump-like Canadian candidate, who everyone was expecting to win, hasn't been doing as well, because it's possible that citizens in other countries don't like the president of the US sort of pushing them around like that. And so that could be a nice irony if that was what saved the Canadian Liberals.
Do you think the UK has made itself less vulnerable to the whims of Donald Trump and the US by leaving the EU?
Well, in a sense, that appears in the short term to be the situation. But I mean, the world is divided into three great blocks, isn't it? America, China and Europe. And when we had the Brexit vote, we had a choice as to who we go closest to. And I profoundly believe that we made the wrong choice, and that seems to be more and more widely accepted. It just seemed very odd to have a partnership with a country that's 2,000 miles away rather than a continent that's 20 miles away. And we've done so in a way that makes us very subservient. It's not a proper partnership. The Americans refused to agree a trade deal and are still refusing to, because they can hold it over Britain as a threat, as a way of getting their wishes on taxation, regulation, and of course on terms of trade.
Is there an indirect impact on the UK? Let's assume that Donald Trump is true to his word and tariffs are imposed on the EU pretty soon, I think he said. The UK remains not impacted. Do those tariffs on the EU, will they have any impact on us? Is there a knock-on effect, regardless of whether UK products are
I think there very much is, because we buy a lot of things from the EU, which will go up in price. So yes, I think we're in no way isolated or insulated from these issues. But also, Trump is mostly using tariffs as a bargaining chip. It's all about throwing his weight around, might is right, and the idea that the Americans should get as much as they can for themselves. And I don't think that ties up with the many Americans who I know who recognise that theirs is a very wealthy country, and they would like to see America do more to help the world and perhaps not quite so much to help itself.
How do you see this panning out, though? Will Donald Trump get his way? He's arguably the most powerful leader in the world. He'll get what he wants, won't he?
It's very hard to predict. He has a way, and we've seen it in the Middle East discussions this week. He has a way of putting his foot in it. And so I don't know what... I think you say he'll get what he wants. It's not exactly clear what he wants.
He wants to win. He wants to win and be seen as a winner, and what that win looks like, I don't think any of us can guess.
But it does feel, Rachel, doesn't it, as if many of the countries that he's picking on, if that's the right word, they're quite complicit and willing to allow him to look like a winner. Mexico and China, and Canada, I'm thinking of in particular. And I suppose Britain is the same. I mean, the way Keir Starmer speaks about him, very deferential and very willing to change his view to be in line with the American view. He's willing to allow Trump to be the winner.
Given the tentacles of the US seemingly reach far and wide, is there any way that Britain can extricate itself from this level of influence and the level of US-owned Britain, if you like?
Well, what I argue in Vassal State is that we need to start by doing more measuring, that we're so ignorant about the extent to which America owns us and controls us, that we need to measure more. And then I think we need to establish our independence and stop the takeovers, to stop allowing our companies to be sold on the cheap or at all to foreign owners. And then we need to have strong partnerships with Europe. And all those things are very doable. And I don't think that means saying that we're against America. European countries are very successful in being independent while still being under the NATO umbrella. So I think that's what Britain should do. But we're so much in thrall to the Americans, and particularly our leadership. I think we hoped for after the period of Tory leadership and vacillation, I think we hoped for more independence from Keir Starmer, and we're not seeing it yet.
No, and it's fair to say that many in the Tory leadership have benefited from this business relationship with the US.
Absolutely, absolutely. Many people in politics and in business are very compromised. They do very well from the American relationship in the short term, but in the long term, it's basically selling the country down the river.